Do you ever consult your parents now about your professional career or what you might do with your life?
Not in any such terms, no. I mean, I discuss it with them, but I feel, they're marvelous in as much as they've never interfered in a certain sense. You know, they've never, they've, I suppose with being away from them in reality from the age of 17, they must have worried at that time, though quite naturally, me being in London. But I think they think I've done all right, and I think in a certain sense they're quite willing to let me carry on.
If you had a crisis in your life and a really difficult decision to take, would you go and talk to your parents about it or not? Honestly.
No, I don't think so. I think that I would try and manage it myself.
Does this mean that you, having come to London and branched out into a very different sort of life, that to some extent at least you now reject their standards of taste or of behaviour?
Well, in a certain way, when one is 17 and when one comes to London and becomes a student, one at first, after settling down, one feels at first that you are different, that you're now, if you like, a bohemian, that you're now living in a different world and you're a very different person and that the old standards have gone. But in fact, those 17 years of one's upbringing are very in there, you know, and you cannot throw them out, even if you want to. And even now, I react to certain things, rather surprisingly, in the way I was brought up to react, in a way, which is after 8 years. So that, in spite of my, of course, quite naturally, I do live in a different world. There are new influences in my life and new fields I've gone into, quite naturally. So that, in a certain extent, I have moved away from my home and my upbringing. But at the same time, there are still very strong sort of ties there, which I think are very useful for me, because in the theatre, in one's profession, there can be rather spoiling influences, and somehow the sort of the sanity or it's a marvelous anchor, I feel, for me.
When you go home nowadays to your parents' house, does it still strike you as the most comfortable place in the world?
Oh, it's marvelous. You can feel the sort of nerves sort of resting, you know. You feel as if you can just sort of lie back when I go home, and that it's not quite the same now because the telephone's going, and so the newspapers are saying, oh, is Mr. Finney there? Well, this was slightly what happened when I stayed there when I did Luther in Manchester on the tour before we came to London. But in fact, it is marvelous, and I do get a marvelous feeling of safeness